Welcome to It's About Time, and thank you for watching us. Imagine walking through a graveyard in 1870. The stones loom tall, black veils sweep past you, and the air smells of wilted lilies left days ago. But among the whispers of mourning, you notice something strange. A woman wearing a bracelet woven entirely from the hair of the deceased. To the Victorians, this was not macabre. It was love made eternal. This is the world of Victorian mourning, the jewelry of hair, the fashion of grief, and the rituals of a society that lived with death at their doorstep. Another strikingly macabre Victorian funeral ritual was post-mortem photography, also called memento mori. When a loved one died, families often hired photographers to take portraits of the deceased. The bodies were carefully posed, sometimes sitting in chairs, propped up with hidden stands, or even arranged to look as if they were peacefully sleeping. Death was everywhere. In Victorian Britain, death was always close. Life expectancy was short, disease rampant, and industrial accidents common. In London's slums, whole families lived above overflowing graveyards, the ground beneath their feet swollen with bodies buried just inches below. The smell was so unbearable that Parliament finally ordered cemeteries to be built outside the city. These garden cemeteries became both places of death and public parks for the living. What about Queen Victoria and the theater of mourning? If one person defined the culture of grief, it was Queen Victoria herself. When Prince Albert died suddenly in 1861, the Queen was inconsolable. But her grief was not private. It became national theater. She dressed in black for the rest of her life. She had Albert's clothes laid out every morning, as if he might return to dress himself. His shaving kit remained untouched, his bed unslept in. Servants were even instructed to bring hot water to his rooms each day, decades after his death. Her obsession turned mourning into fashion. Widows across the empire followed her lead, sometimes for years. To fail to wear black was not just poor etiquette, it was scandalous. Society judged grief by fabric. And then there was the hair, the last relic. Victorian families clipped locks from the dead as sacred relics. Some simply tied them with ribbon. Others went further, weaving hair into bracelets, rings, necklaces, even tiaras. One particularly eerie example is the Blunden family wreath, a massive hair wreath made from the hair of dozens of family members, each curl turned into a flower. It still survives today, a twisted family tree where the roots are literally human remains. But not all hair jewelry was voluntary. Stories circulated of undertakers pocketing hair from corpses and selling it to jewelers. The demand was so high that the line between love and commerce blurred. Victorian funerals were spectacles. Black-plumed horses pulled mourning coaches, the coffin draped in velvet. Families hired professional mourners, people who could cry on command, ensuring the deceased appeared well-loved. Even the coffin became a stage. Some were fitted with windows, so loved ones could gaze at the face of the dead as the coffin passed. In America, patent records from the period show inventions for safety coffins with bells and air tubes, devices meant to prevent premature burial, a real fear at the time. Victorians started using cemeteries as gardens of death. The Victorians didn't just bury their dead, they visited them, picnicked among them, and courted among their graves. Highgate Cemetery in London, for example, became a fashionable weekend destination. Families strolled among elaborate tombs, reading epitaphs like one might read novels. Gravestones were carved as beds, books, urns, even tiny houses. Death became architecture. But beneath the beauty lurked horror. Grave diggers sometimes discovered coffins leaking bodily fluids, flooding into soil that ran into the city's water supply. Entire neighborhoods feared miasma, the belief that bad smells spread disease. Yet people still flocked to cemeteries, finding comfort in the very places they feared. Let's talk about post-mortem photography. One of the most chilling mourning practices. The invention of the daguerreotype made photographs cheaper, but most families never photographed their children until death gave them reason. Infants were dressed in white, posed as if asleep. Older children were propped up with siblings, eyes painted open afterward on the photograph. In one haunting case, a young girl was photographed sitting upright in a chair, her grieving parents holding her hands, their faces gaunt with sorrow. To the modern eye, the stiffness gives her away, but to Victorians, it was the only photograph they would ever have. Mourning was not just grief, it was status. A wealthy widow might wear fine black silk, while a poor widow wore cheap cotton dyed in soot. A family's mourning wreath displayed in the parlor became a signal to visitors. We mourn, we are respectable, we are loyal. In some towns, people even monitored how long their neighbors stayed in mourning. Return to colors too soon, and you risked whispers of coldness, or worse, adultery. Death, in Victorian society, was the ultimate social performance. Of course, some cases went beyond custom into the grotesque. In 1864, newspapers reported on a widow in Birmingham who refused to bury her husband, keeping his decomposing body in the house for months. She insisted he wasn't truly gone, but merely sleeping. In rural Scotland, families sometimes exhumed hair from old graves to weave new jewelry, especially if they lacked hair from the recently deceased. Imagine wearing a bracelet from your great-grandmother's remains, years after she'd turned to dust. Even Queen Victoria herself clung to Albert's possessions with a desperation some courtiers whispered was madness. She kept a plaster cast of his hand by her bedside, touching it each night as though holding the real thing. The decline of mourning culture started by the early 20th century. World War I brought death on a scale too vast for such rituals. Entire villages lost their young men. How could anyone wear black long enough to honor them all? Mourning became private, restrained, practical. Hair jewelry was tucked away in drawers, dismissed as grotesque relics. Cemeteries became less like parks and more like silent fields of stone. Death moved out of the parlor and into hospitals. And so, the Victorian dance with death ended, leaving behind strange relics of grief that today look more like horror props than tokens of love. But walk through a Victorian cemetery today, and you still feel it. The heavy stone angels, the iron fences, the lingering whispers of a society that lived with death not as a shadow, but as a constant companion. A bracelet of braided hair, a black veil trailing in the wind, a photograph of the dead child who never grew up. These were not morbid curiosities to the Victorians. They were love, grief, and memory, made tangible. We might call it macabre. They would call it devotion. So next time you see a lock of hair tied in ribbon, or a faded photograph of a solemn family, ask yourself, is it mourning, or is it immortality? Thank you for watching. Please subscribe for more Victorian history and leave a comment for feedback.